My name is Ann Koenigsmark, and I'm an English teacher, a writer, and a former journalist. And now, I am your host for Cocktail Party Takeaways, a podcast for anyone with regrets, but not deep ones, about the books they slept through in high school. In this episode, I will take you through the second half of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. We left off where Jordan had told Nick that Gatsby constructed his elaborate party house solely in the hope that Daisy would take notice one day on no particular time schedule. And there he had been waiting, like a spider on an elaborate web, for literally years. Finally, Daisy does take notice, although Gatsby has to manipulate things a bit, getting Nick to ask her over to tea at his place next door so that he can jump scare her to death by walking in unannounced, soaked from the rain, for the big reunion. In the last episode, I asked you to park several details in your mental parking lot for later. We will revisit those in this episode. In the classroom, kids pick up on things that you don't even know you're doing. Apparently, I use that parking lot image quite a bit, as some kids will ask, should I put this one in long-term parking or just valet it? Sometimes they draw a parking lot on the board and move the cars in and out over the course of a lecture. And here's another thing some kids picked up on many years ago. One day, after I'd asserted that Gregor Samsa from Kafka's The Metamorphosis is actually a Christ figure, and that the scenes with Gregor's mom smacked of edible sexual innuendo, a kid raised his hand and said, "Mrs. K, do you think every book is about Jesus and sex?" Yes, Timmy. Yes, I do. So, dear listeners, I will request that you park that little story in the parking lot as well. Okay, we left off at Chapter 6. A chapter whose beginning hints around at Gatsby doing something illegal, probably bootlegging, although Nick leaves it just vague enough that those of us rooting for Gatsby can think that's just maybe another vicious rumor. None of it seems to bother Gatsby. Nick writes, just why those inventions were a source of satisfaction to James Gatz of North Dakota isn't easy to say. That's right, Jay Gatsby of San Francisco in the Midwest is actually James Gatz of North Dakota. Talk about your takeaways. So then we get Gatsby's actual real origin story, which begins when he was 17 and spotted a yacht anchored in Lake Superior. This yacht apparently represented everything young James Gatz wanted and everything he was not, so he grabbed a rowboat and paddled his way out there, changing his name to Jay Gatsby along the way. The owner of the yacht takes a shine to the young man and hires him on the spot. Gatz, now Gatsby, quote, knew women early, but would quickly become, quote, contemptuous of them because they were like real and all, and he was in the business of dreaming, always dreaming. Quote, his heart was in a constant, turbulent riot. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. A universe of ineffable gaudiness spun itself out in his brain while the clock ticked on the washstand and the moon soaked with wet light his tangled clothes upon the floor. For a while these reveries provided an outlet for his imagination. They were a satisfactory hint of the unreality of reality, a promise that the rock of the world was founded securely on a fairy's wing. Even as I typed that into my script, and even though I taught Gatsby several times a day for 8 years, this paragraph confuses me. But it feels important. Fitzgerald is taking some pretty big liberties here, narratively speaking. The narration has jumped into Gatsby's head, claiming an omniscience that was not there when we were hearing everything from Nick's point of view. Nick comes back in a few pages with an, "Oh, Gatsby told me all this much later, but I felt like you guys needed to know this now." But I doubt Gatsby unfurled the deepest workings of his heart to that extent. Anyway, I think we are supposed to understand that Gatsby is a major big-time dreamer, and that his dreams were to Nick, well, tacky? Anyway, before the yacht incident, Gatsby had enrolled in St. Olaf's College in Minnesota, but dropped out after 2 weeks because he resented the janitor work he had to do to pay his way through, and because the place had a, quote, ferocious indifference to the drums of his destiny. In other words, they didn't see him as great. He boards the yacht, captained by the mysterious Dan Cody, hoping it will sail him to his destiny. Some years later, he exits the yacht, still penniless but wise to the ways of the world. This is apparently when he enlists in the army and then meets Daisy. So we are now all caught up. Sort of. So the second half of the chapter brings us back to the present and a super awkward daytime visit to Gatsby's mansion by Tom Buchanan, who rides up on horseback with a couple of his pals. They proceed to be super snobby to Gatsby, but poor Gatsby, he doesn't catch on. He is just intent on soaking up every inch of his competition. "I know your wife," he says to Tom, a tad aggressively. Tom doesn't really take the bait, but later, when Gatsby is out of the room, Tom says, "I wonder where in the devil he met Daisy. By God, I may be old-fashioned in my ideas, but women run around too much these days to suit me." All right, ladies. All right, sit down. I know. I want to stab him in the eyeballs too. But don't worry, he gets worse. The following Saturday night, Tom and Daisy attend an actual Gatsby party. It is sparkling, there are celebrities to gawk at, and Daisy gets to dance with Gatsby. But guess what? She doesn't like it. Quote, "She was appalled by West Egg, this unprecedented place that Broadway had begotten upon a Long Island fishing village, appalled by its raw vigor that chafed under the old euphemisms and by the too obtrusive fate that herded its inhabitants along a shortcut from nothing to nothing." Honestly, I think in today's world, an editor would have said to Scotty, "Dude, the hell? Just say she's old money, he's new money, she's a fantastic snob. The end." Tom then says the word that has been hanging in the air throughout the book. He wonders aloud if Gatsby is, quote, "some big bootlegger." Nick quickly comes to his friend's defense. Not Gatsby. But Tom vows he's going to do some digging around for himself to find out. When the party's over, Gatsby says to Nick, she didn't like it. And Nick ascertains, with growing dread, that Gatsby, quote, wanted nothing less of Daisy than that she should go to Tom and say, "I never loved you." So Nick gently advises, "I wouldn't expect too much of her. You can't repeat the past." And Gatsby replies with what I call the big uh-oh line, and for sure a cocktail party takeaway. "Can't repeat the past?" he cried incredulously. "Why, of course you can." Whew! Now we have another notion-y hero on our hands. Like Eleanor from The Haunting of Hill House, poor Gatsby is a doomed dreamer. So we have arrived at Chapter 7, the climax of the story. Okay, class, what do we mean when we say climax in a piece of literature? It is the moment of greatest tension, the point of no return, when someone says or does something that tips things towards an inevitable conclusion. The chapter begins with Gatsby in the full throes of an affair with Daisy. Afternoon delight is kept hush-hush because he fires all his servants and replaces them with a ragtag bunch of Wolfsheim flunkies who know how to keep their mouths shut. And he stops having parties, presumably because Daisy disapproves of them. Or maybe, more simply, now that the spider has caught his fly, there's no need for the elaborate web. Nick says, quote, his career as Trimalchio was over. Trimalchio, for your information, is a character in Satyricon, a first-century Roman story by Petronius. He was an arrogant slave who became rich in some distasteful way. I totally didn't just look that up on Wikipedia. Great cocktail party takeaway, by the way, but also huge snob alert that Nick/Fitzgerald is just throwing this around like it's a well-known illusion. Okay, class, what is an allusion? It's a reference in a literary work to a presumably known person, story, character, or event, such as a Bible verse, or in this case, a weird ancient story no one has actually ever heard of. So we find ourselves at the Buchanans, where apparently a luncheon has been arranged for Daisy, Tom, Nick, Jordan, and Gatsby. Cozy. The day is hot, broiling, it says, the warmest of the summer. The story's heating up, the weather's heating up. You get the idea. Nice touch, Scotty. So while the rest of them stand around in one room, Tom's in the hall on the phone, maybe to his girl, maybe not. They drink gin Rickies, and then Daisy says, "What do we do with ourselves this afternoon? And the day after that? And the next 30 years? To which Jordan, ever practical, replies, "Don't be morbid. Life starts all over again when it gets crisp in the fall." But Daisy says, almost crying, "But it's so hot, and everything's so confused. Let's all go to town." This is when I realize that Daisy is punching above her emotional weight with this whole thing with Gatsby. But maybe I say that because I know how things turn out. And then this happens. Tom walks back in the room as Gatsby and Daisy have forgotten themselves and are staring at each other. Daisy says to Gatsby twice, "You always look so cool." And Tom sees it all. I love how Fitzgerald articulates this. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded. A few minutes later, Nick remarks to Gatsby that Daisy has an indiscreet voice. "It's full of," and Gatsby finishes the sentence, "It's full of money." So, Jay, you might want to adjust your mask. Your inner James Gatz is showing. Time to take a couple of cars out of that crowded parking lot from the last episode. When Gatsby first reunites with Daisy, Nick says it was her voice that seemed to hold him the most. And perhaps now we can more surely affix money to the symbol of the green light. When Gatsby stares longingly across the courtesy bay at the light at the end of Daisy's dock, he is yearning not just for Daisy, but for what she represents: wealth, status. I will acknowledge it would be easy to simply dismiss Gatsby at this point as a shallow, poor kid who fell in love with a rich girl, but I still maintain it's more complex than that. Nick, by the way, agrees with Gatsby's assessment. That was it, he says. I'd never understood it before. It was full of money. That was the inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it, the jingle of it, the symbol's song of it, high in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl. The next 15 pages are the funniest, the tensest, and the most gut-wrenching of the whole novel. They don't call it a climax for nothing, people. Gatsby suggests they all go into the city in his car, but Tom says he wants to drive Gatsby's car, and he wants Gatsby to drive his car. No reason is given, but he wants his wife to go with him in the circus wagon. She demurs, pushing Nick and Jordan toward Tom, and jumps in Tom's blue coupe with Gatsby. Once they get going, Tom tells his company that he's made an investigation of Gatsby. Jordan finds this funny and says, "And you found out he was an Oxford man." "An Oxford man? Like hell he is. He wears a pink suit." On the way, they stop at Wilson's garage to get gas. This will be important later, but while they are there, Tom lies and says the car is his and offers to sell it to Mr. Wilson. Wilson admits he needs money because, he says, he wants to move out west. "I just got wised up to something funny the last 2 days," he says. He insinuates he knows his wife is cheating on him. Twice in this scene, Nick notices the eyes of T.J. Eckelberg watching. Also watching is Myrtle from an upstairs room, taking in the scene and making some fatally wrong assumptions. So Tom, meanwhile, is having a real afternoon of it. First, his wife is clearly in love with another man, and now his mistress has been found out by her husband, although clearly Wilson does not know who his wife has been with. Tom's about to be out 2 women in one afternoon. Once they arrive in the city, they decide to rent a suite in the Plaza Hotel so they can, get in an argument? They say it so they can drink the whiskey they've brought with them. They have a bellboy bring up some ice and fresh mint. There's a page or two of funny but meaningless chatter. "It's so hot, open another window. There aren't any more. Well, then somebody telephone for an axe." Jordan's wit is on particular display here. They can hear Mendelssohn's Wedding March coming from the lobby. Oh, the irony. And then Tom gets down to business. I no longer teach Gatsby, but when I did, I always made the kids get up and act out this scene. So for you listeners, I've created a radio show, old-timey style. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Juju Radio Hour, brought to you by Juju Energy. No doubt about it, Juju is the best energy and focus drink on the market. It's a healthy, great-tasting, professional-grade energy and performance formula. Gamers love it, but I am talking to all you juggling moms out there. This stuff is hope in a shaker cup. Me here. Juju is a real thing, and you should check it out. On sale at jujuenergy.com. That's JUJUenergy.com or at Amazon. On tonight's episode, we bring you Showdown at the Plaza.
By the way, Mr. Gatsby, I understand you're an Oxford man.
Not exactly.
Oh, yes, I understand you went to Oxford.
Yes, I went there.
This tremendous detail was to be cleared up at last.
I told you I went there.
I heard you, but I'd like to know when.
It was in 1919. I only stayed 5 months. That's why I can't really call myself an Oxford man. It was an opportunity they gave to some of the officers after the armistice. We could go to any of the universities in England or France.
I wanted to get up and slap him on the back. I had one of those complete renewals of faith in him that I'd experienced before. Open the whiskey, Tom, and I'll make you a mint julep. Then you won't seem so stupid to yourself.
Wait a minute. I want to ask Mr. Gatsby one more question.
Go on.
What kind of a row are you trying to cause in my house anyhow?
They were out in the open at last, and Gatsby was content. He isn't causing a row. You're causing a row. Please have a little self-control.
Self-control? I suppose the latest thing is to sit back and let Mr. Nobody from nowhere make love to your wife. Well, if that's the idea, you can count me out. Nowadays, people begin by sneering at family life and family institutions. And next they'll throw everything overboard and have intermarriage between black and white.
Sorry, I have to butt in. I mean, again, how racist do you have to be for an argument about your wife's faithfulness to devolve in 3 sentences into a panic over racial mixing? This is too much even for the crowd at the plaza. Let's get back to Nick's narration. Flushed with his impassioned gibberish, Tom saw himself standing alone on the last barrier of civilization. We're all white here, murmured Jordan. Sorry, me again. This is hands down the funniest line in the book. So interesting that Fitzgerald gives it to Jordan.
I know I'm not very popular. I don't have big parties. I suppose you've got to make your house into a pigsty in order to have any friends in the modern world.
Angry as I was, as we all were, I was tempted to laugh whenever he opened his mouth. The transition from libertine to prig was so complete.
I've got something to tell you, old sport.
Please don't. Please, let's all go home. Why don't we all go home?
I want to know what Mr. Gatsby has to tell me.
Your wife doesn't love you. She's never loved you. She loves me.
You must be crazy.
She never loved you, do you hear? She only married you because I was poor and she was tired of waiting for me. It was a terrible mistake, but in her heart she never loved anyone except me.
At this point, Jordan and I tried to go, but Tom and Gatsby insisted with competitive firmness that we remain, as though neither of them had anything to conceal, and it would be a privilege to partake vicariously of their emotions.
Sit down, Daisy. What's been going on? I want to hear all about it.
I told you what's been going on. Going on for 5 years, and you didn't know.
You've been seeing this fellow for 5 years?
Not seeing. No, we couldn't meet. But both of us loved each other all that time, old sport, and you didn't know. I used to laugh sometimes to think that you didn't know.
You're crazy. I can't speak about what happened 5 years ago because I didn't know Daisy then. And I'll be damned if I see how you got within a mile of her unless you brought the groceries to the back door. But all the rest of that's a goddamn lie. Daisy loved me when she married me, and she loves me now.
No.
She does, though. The trouble is that sometimes she gets foolish ideas in her head and doesn't know what she's doing.
Me again. Am I the only one who notices Daisy hasn't said a single word for a page and a half? Sorry, excuse me.
And what's more, I love Daisy too. Once in a while, I go off on a spree and make a fool of myself, but I always come back. And in my heart, I love her all the time.
You're revolting. Do you know why we left Chicago? I'm surprised they didn't treat you to the story of that little spree. Gatsby walked over and stood beside her.
Daisy, that's all over now. It doesn't matter anymore. Just tell him the truth, that you never loved him, and it's all wiped out forever.
Why, how could I love him? Possibly. She hesitated. Her eyes fell on Jordan and me with a sort of appeal, as though she realized at last what she was doing, as though she had never, all along, intended doing anything at all. But it was done now. It was too late. I never loved him.
Not at Capogliani?
No. From the ballroom beneath, muffled and suffocating, chords were drifting up on hot waves of air.
Not that day I carried you down from the punch bowl to keep your shoes dry? Daisy?
Please don't. She looked at Gatsby, but her hand as she tried to light a cigarette was trembling. Suddenly, she threw the cigarette and the burning match on the carpet. Oh, you want too much! I love you now! Isn't that enough? I can't help what's past. I did love him once, but I loved you too. Gatsby's eyes opened and closed.
You loved me too?
Even that's a lie. She didn't know you were alive. Why, there are things between Daisy and me that you'll never know. Things that neither of us can ever forget.
The words seemed to bite physically into Gatsby.
I want to speak to Daisy alone.
Even alone, I can't say I never loved Tom. It wouldn't be true.
Of course it wouldn't.
As if it mattered to you.
Of course it matters. I'm going to take better care of you from now on.
You don't understand. You're not going to take care of her anymore.
I'm not? Why's that?
Daisy's leaving you.
Nonsense.
I am, though.
She's not leaving me. Certainly not for a common swindler who'd have to steal the ring he put on her finger.
I won't stand this. Oh, please, let's get out.
Who are you, anyhow? You're one of that bunch that hangs around with Meyer Wolfsheim, that much I happen to know. He and this Wolfsheim bought up a lot of side street drugstores here and in Chicago, and sold grain alcohol over the counter. That's one of his little stunts. I picked him for a bootlegger the first time I saw him, and I wasn't far wrong. That drugstore business was just small change.
I glanced at Daisy, who was staring terrified between Gatsby and her husband. Then I turned back to Gatsby and was startled at his expression. He looked, and this is said in all contempt for the babbled slander of his garden, as if he had killed a man. For a moment the set of his face could be described in just that fantastic way. It passed, and he began to talk excitedly to Daisy, denying everything, defending his name against accusations that had not been made. But with every word, she was drawing further and further into herself. So he gave that up, and only the dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away, trying to touch what was no longer tangible, struggling unhappily, undespairingly, toward that lost voice across the room. The voice begged again to go. Please, Tom, I can't stand this anymore. Her frightened eyes told that whatever intentions, whatever courage she had had, were definitely gone.
You two start on home, Daisy, in Mr. Gatsby's car. Go on. He won't annoy you. I think he realizes that his presumptuous little flirtation is over.
They were gone, without a word, snapped out, made accidental, isolated like ghosts, even from our pity. It was 7 o'clock when we got into the coupe with him and started for Long Island. So we drove on toward death through the cooling twilight. So what happens next might seem like it is the climax of the story, but now that is behind us. You loved him too? Really, what is to come is just the inevitable end of the events set in motion in that Plaza suite. On the way back to the eggs from the city that night, Gatsby's big yellow car is driving too fast through the Valley of Ashes when it passes Wilson's garage. Wilson, desperate to keep Myrtle long enough to move her out west and away from the lover that he is now sure she has locked her in an upstairs room. But when she sees that car, which, as you recall, Tom was driving on the way into the city, she escapes her little jail and runs out in the road to meet him. The death car, as the newspapers called it, didn't stop. It came out of the gathering darkness, wavered tragically for a moment, and then disappeared around the next bend. In the aftermath, Myrtle lies dead and bleeding in the dust. Witnesses run to her and tear open her dress to see if she is still breathing. They saw that her, quote, left breast was swinging loose like a flap, and there was no need to listen for the heart beneath. Time to pull another car out of that parking lot. Remember all those car wrecks I keep pointing out? Now you know they were clearly foreshadowing. And remember, they all had a front wheel shorn clean off, which would appear now to be presaging this gruesome amputation. So Tom, Nick, and Jordan come upon this scene not too long after, and Tom, racked with grief once he discovers what's what, keeps himself together long enough to assure Wilson that he was not driving the death car and that he has just now driven up on the scene in his usual car. His name cleared, Tom gets back in the blue car, and they head to East Egg. Sobbing, he says to Nick and Jordan, speaking of Gatsby, "The goddamn coward. He didn't even stop his car." But here's the thing. Gatsby wasn't driving. Daisy was. So Tom, Jordan, and Nick arrive back at the Buchanans, and Tom can see from outside that Daisy is there. He asks the others in, but Nick declines and says he will wait outside for a taxi. As he stands alone, Gatsby appears from behind some bushes. When he starts to describe what happened, Nick, quote, guessed at the truth. "Was Daisy driving?" he asks. "Yes," Gatsby admits after a pause. "But of course, I'll say I was." He explains that Daisy insisted on driving to calm her nerves. When the woman ran out in the road, at first Daisy turned away from the woman and toward the car coming the other way. Then she, quote, lost her nerve and turned back. So in other words, Daisy was not willing to have a head-on collision and instead saved herself by killing Myrtle. And now Gatsby will save her by saying he was the one who was driving. Park that thought in the parking lot just for a sec. Better yet, just tell the valet to keep the car running. Nick walks closer to the house and takes a peek in the kitchen window, where he sees Tom and Daisy sitting opposite each other with a plate of fried chicken between them. They are talking intently, and one of Tom's hands covers one of Daisy's. They weren't happy, Nick says, and yet they weren't unhappy either. There was an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together. As Nick walks away from Gatsby, he says he left him standing there in the moonlight, watching over nothing, because Nick knows, and we know, the dream is dead. So Chapter 8 begins with Gatsby reminiscing to Nick about when he met Daisy. This is basically a retelling of the story Jordan told Nick earlier, but now from Gatsby's point of view. He says he was, at the time, a penniless man without a past who blended in and captured Daisy's attention because he wore an army uniform. He, quote, took Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. Racy. He knew he was kinda lying to her, letting her believe he was from the same social class as she. But he, quote, felt married to her. That was all. And why did he love her so intensely? He describes seeing her on her porch, bright with the bought luxury of starshine, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes, and of Daisy, gleaming like silver, safe and proud, above the hot struggles of the poor. If that doesn't tell you what money buys, I don't know what does. He admits that when he went to war and then to Oxford, she simply got bored waiting and began dating again and eventually found Tom. When the story is over, Nick shouts across his lawn as he is leaving, and this is a major cocktail party takeaway. They're a rotten crowd. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. He then says, I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from beginning to end. The scene then shifts to the Valley of Ashes, where Wilson is in deep mourning. While he is talking to his neighbor, he says he is going to find out who murdered his wife. The neighbor gently tries to say it was an accident, but Wilson is having none of it. He looks up at the billboard of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg and says, "God sees everything," to which the neighbor says, "That's an advertisement." The scene ends with Wilson off on a manhunt. He heads to East Egg to talk to Tom, who leads him right to Gatsby's door. How helpful of him. Soon Wilson is in West Egg. I wonder if Tom simply gave him a name or drew him a nice map to be sure the poor man didn't get lost. Okay, so pay attention to the following scene, and then I'm going to share a theory and all of its accompanying evidence. At 2 o'clock, the narrative states, Gatsby puts on his bathing suit and tells the butler that if anyone phones, word should be brought to him at the pool. I wish I'd had a butler in high school, then I wouldn't have been canceling plans to sit around the house waiting for some boy to call. He stops at the garage for a pneumatic mattress, a pool float, that had amused his guests during the summer, and the chauffeur helps him pump it up. Gatsby shouldered the mattress and started for the pool. Once he stopped and shifted it a little, and the chauffeur asked him if he needed help, but he shook his head. Lying on his pool float for the first time all summer, Gatsby's last vision is of an ashen, fantastic figure on the edge of the pool. It is Wilson, who shoots him dead. So long ago, a couple of years into my teaching career, I was sitting at home one evening, rereading this scene in order to teach it the next day, when I jumped off the sofa and screamed, "Oh my God, Gatsby is Jesus." Why do I say that? It's a seemingly insignificant detail from this scene that got me going. Gatsby carries the thing he will die on, the pool float, to the place where he will be shot, the pool, just as Jesus carried his own cross at least part of the way to Golgotha. And it has long been held, although weirdly none of the Gospels mentions it, that the reason a man named Simon is called upon to carry Jesus' cross part of the way is because Jesus stumbles and needs help. Gatsby, too, is asked if he needs help carrying his cross, his pool float. When I began to look for more evidence of my theory, that little spark turned into a flame. Let's start with the most meaningful piece of evidence, Gatsby's self-sacrifice for Daisy. "Of course I'll say I did it," he says, for Gatsby so loved Daisy that he gave his life for her, if I may appropriate and mangle John 3:16 from the Bible. But I would go further than that. I would argue that Gatsby dies so that this rotten crowd can keep on being rotten and in charge for a little while longer. Nick sums up the paradox of Gatsby when he says he is worth all of them put together, even though he disapproved of everything he did. Sure, this is a shady bootlegger, not to mention a nobody from nowhere who will stop at nothing to get rich. That is one way to read the story. But this is also the story of a pure-hearted dreamer who felt married to Daisy even when he wasn't, who believed so strongly that dreams can come true that he would sit in his palace by the sea and wait years for fate to take its course. In this way, he is the embodiment of the American dream, a young upstart who believes he can make something out of nothing, who believes he doesn't need an engraved invitation to join the party. And presumptuous outsider upstarts like him are a threat to people like Tom and Daisy. When I began presenting this Jesus thing to students years ago, they would always begin by acting all skeptical, but then they would get in on the game. So some of these little gems are things students have found through the years. Remember how in episode 1, I said I was going to be annoying and not give you all the details from Nick's first impressions of Gatsby? Well, I will provide them now. He says that Gatsby smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance to it. It understood you just as far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself. I don't know about you, but I've never met anyone like that. Next, when Gatsby takes Nick into the city in Chapter 4 and tells him his life story along the way, he says he is going to tell Nick God's truth. The story, as you recall, is rather outlandish. Unbelievable, you might say. It requires a leap of faith. Nick is not ready to make that leap until he sees that war medal and the picture of Gatsby at Oxford. Then it was all true, he says. These physical items become like religious relics for Nick, bolstering his faith in Gatsby the same way Christians can be reassured by pieces of the true cross or the crown of thorns housed at St. Peter's in Rome. In Chapter 6, when we find out that Jay Gatsby came into this world as penniless James Gatz, Nick says, quote, "The truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God," a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that. And he must be about his father's business. Capital H, capital F. You're starting to get interested now, aren't you? At the end of Chapter 6, the narration dips into Gatsby's head and recalls his first night with Daisy. Quote, "He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never again romp like the mind of God. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. Just as God becomes a flesh and blood human and walks among us as Jesus, only to be killed as a sacrificial lamb for the sins of this fallen world, so too Gatsby is made incarnate by Daisy, only to be sacrificed to save her. Finally, Gatsby, like Jesus, becomes a pariah after his death. Remember the apostles hiding out? Well, Nick says in the final chapter of the book, "I wanted to get somebody for him, but no one, not any of the partygoers, not Daisy, not even Wolfsheim, want anything to do with a Gatsby funeral. No one came," Nick says. Finally, Gatsby's father, Henry C. Gatz of Minnesota, arrives to pay his respects. "If he'd have lived, he'd have been a great man," his father says. "He'd have helped build up the country." As he speaks with Nick, he pulls from his pocket a ragged copy of Hopalong Cassidy. He opens it to the back cover, where Gatsby recorded his daily schedule back in 1906. Rise from bed, 6 a.m., dumbbell exercise and wall scaling, 6:15 to 6:30, study electricity, work, baseball and sports, practice elocution, poise, and how to attain it, study needed inventions. "It just goes to show you," Mr. Gatz says. So what I love about this schedule is that it very closely resembles the one that Benjamin Franklin, another up-from-the-bootstraps dreamer who in fact did help to build up this country, details in his autobiography. There's no way that study electricity and study needed inventions is not a nod to our kite-flying, inventive founding father. And there's no way that this wink-wink reference is not intended to set our minds thinking about what this country is all about, what it was founded on, and what it has become. In the last 3 pages of the book, Nick runs into Tom, who defends his decision to tell Wilson how to find Gatsby. It is clear from the conversation that either Daisy has lied to Tom about who was driving, or Tom is lying to Nick, because he again expresses his outrage that Gatsby hit Myrtle and didn't stop the car. "It was all very careless and confused," Nick narrates. "They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess they had made." This paragraph explains why there are so many car crashes in the novel. Not only do they provide foreshadowing for Myrtle's death, but they come to symbolize the recklessness of a certain class of people at a certain moment in time. So we are at the end of the summer and the end of the novel. When I used to read the last page of The Great Gatsby to students, I would have to make mental grocery lists or think about cleaning out my closets, anything banal that would distract me from the sob-inducing words on that last glorious page. If I start to blubber here, my trusty producer will just edit it out. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face, for the last time in history, with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. This idea that the only time America was a pure dream was before any European set foot on it, when we could only see it from the prow of a ship, just knocks me flat. And I think that is what the story is mirroring. Gatsby is those sailors, and Daisy is the dream, the flower, the green breast, the green light. But as soon as he kissed her, the dream began to die. Nick continues, speaking of Gatsby. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch our arms out farther, and one fine morning. And here comes that final line in the final cocktail party takeaway of The Great Gatsby. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. I'll leave you to interpret that as you will, as I believe it means something different for each of us, just like the American dream. For this episode, special thanks go out to my fellow actors in the radio show, Atlanta actor Jake Mercer and Atlanta high school student Ansley Stibbs. I'd also like to give a shout out to Mackie Audio. Thanks for the CRX monitors, condenser mic, and mic stand. We literally couldn't have made this episode without Mackie. If you enjoyed this episode of Cocktail Party Takeaways, please show your love, rate it, like it, download it, and leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen. Let's get social. Follow me on Twitter at AnneRochelle67. That's ANNEROCHELL 67. Want to know how to make one of the cocktails served in The Great Gatsby? Head over to my blog at AnneRochelle.com to find recipes for the Gin Ricky and the Mint Julep. AnneRochelle.com is also where you can go for more information about me or about the podcast. That's Anne with an E, Rochelle without. And please, if you like Cocktail Party Takeaways, tell a friend, tell an enemy, tell a stranger at the grocery store. Cocktail Party Takeaways is produced by Gus Koenigsmark with original music by Gus Koenigsmark. Cover art by Stuart Key. Cheers, and let's all read more.